Hey everybody, how's it going today? And today, audio should be better. I kind of think it was a few things, and I kind of fixed those. I'll try to test the audio at the start of the video, before the start of the video, so that you guys don't have that issue. So, should be clean now. Hopefully it won't be as much popping going on. So, how you doing this week? Well, bad news continues, and I still got a handful of news stories to cover over the next coming weeks. Unfortunately, plenty of backlog happened over this last month, for sure. I do like, it reminds me of how much I kind of like the quieter times. Because unfortunately, another sort of bad news has sort of reared its ugly head, and that is regarding a furry convention in Florida named Megaplex. So Megaplex had announced that starting this year, before the convention takes place, only people who are ages of 18 plus will be able to register and attend the convention. For those of you who are not aware, Megaplex is a furry convention. And ironically, the name Megaplex seems kind of very obfuscated. It sounds kind of like a gaming convention. And in the irony of things, the reason that Megaplex was named in the way that it was as an ironic intention to sort of obfuscate that it was a furry convention. One of the big reasons for this is I think it's actually pretty confirmed at this point. But one of the things about it is that in Florida, that Disney is a big corporation, and that a lot of furries, who like anthropomorphic characters and things like that, might find interest in working for a company like Disney for some obvious reasons. But, Disney has this very family-friendly affair, whereas the furry fandom, particularly in the earlier 2000s, very much leaned towards more mature content and things like that. So a big concern and fear amongst the furry fandom was that basically if the Disney had found out that a furry was working for their company via a convention that advertised itself as anthro-furry sort of content, that there could be issues with employment. The irony is, and now some weird things about history though, is that even back then, it was, people under 18, 13 and plus were allowed if in the company of a guardian, right? Like most conventions would do. Because basically the boundaries on which children learn things is really determined by what their parents wish, right? It's sort of a staple in this country of ours, is that, the parent or guardian has seek guardianship over their child until they are in the age of 18, where that person who's 18 can legally vote, can legally can't legally do drugs like smoking and alcohol. That's 21 now for most states. But they can go, sign up for the military service. Though I'll say this, when a lot of people's criticism about the smoking and drinking thing is that, like, they can, in America, you could be 18 or over, or you could be 18 and serve your country, but you can't smoke or drink. Well, you can smoke or drink, but usually if you're serving overseas, there's more leniency because you're not in the United States proper. Whereas if you stay domestic, right, you're going to have those laws that confer that. So it's not really apples and oranges. Kind of getting a weird off-topic and tangent thing, but American politics is sort of this way, where it's got that weird thing. Now, because of recent laws in Florida that are pushing towards trying to sort of limit what Florida state institutions can allow children to be taught and things like that, there's also a push for what the state allows, what kind of performances the state allows to occur before children. And because of that new law that was implemented, which is listed here as it was a State House Bill number 1438, right? And so it goes here that because of that live bill performance bill, our resolution was passed in Florida state law, that in order to protect the revenue, or in order to protect the institutions that are allowing Megaplex to occur, Megaplex is basically saying, well, we're not going to allow those things for the first time since their opening in 2003. So what does that entail, right? So what does this rule entail? There's a link in the description below to a full article I did. Will be a lot quicker, once again, a lot quicker to do than listening to a video, but I know people like to listen to videos sometimes, so we're just going to go over this real quick. The issue here is that the House bill basically pertains to performances and audiences and things like that. America has some guidelines for like motion pictures, PG-13, etc. Similar things sort of exist for live performances. In this case, we're talking about those kind of live performances. There's obviously some things that are kind of like, general, like, okay, yeah, that's, fine and good. But there are some verbiage and wordage that kind of opens up things to the interpretation of the state. And I think that's why Megaplex is being precautious about basically restricting any ticket sales of the convention to people 18 plus. By the way, in that announcement, they say, well, we're not going to change the behavior of the con, right? So they're not going to go like, well, it's an 18 plus con, now let your freak flag fly, right? They're like, no, we're going to keep the, sort of spirit of, being an all ages, being sort of a PG gathering in the main spaces, even though we're only 18 plus now, right? Because they're saying, well, this law might be temporary. And recent news out of Tennessee, as sort of a caveat to this, is that one of these sort of performance laws in Tennessee actually was deemed as unconstitutional by a federal judge. So it may be possible that the same thing could happen to this Florida law. We don't know yet. But obviously, Megaplex isn't going to be able to reverse this kind of major decision before it happens this summer. So I would still suspect that would maintain itself until that period of time. But always, keep informed of those kind of things. But the rule, I think, that sort of highlighted concern is that basically it notes that these performances are, if one of these kind of situations can fall under this purview of this law. And the law says it's like, well, if it predominantly appeals to prurient, there's that word again. We had that word in a previous video. It's that word again. That fancy word for lucid, for lewd. Shameful or moral or morbid interest. 2, is patently offensive to prevailing standards in the adult community of this state as a whole with respect to what is suitable material or conduct for the age of children present. And then also 3, taken as a whole, is without serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value for the age of the children present. Now, obviously on point 3, nothing... Furries producing things of scientific interest and things to a younger audience, not too much. Sometimes maybe, but Ursa Major's recently released and has some of those kind of results. But I think the big one that kind of makes people scratch their head a little bit is point 2 on that law, and that is, and that is basically, that it's patently offensive to the adults of Florida, which, by the way, is a very hard thing to signify. It's like, did you vote on like what those things are? Like, this is like where it's like, well, you should know it. Like, it's one of those, as somebody who, as people who are like usually neurodivergent, right? Those social situations where they're like, well, it's just something you should know. Like, if somebody does this, then you should know it means the opposite of that. And it's like, well, it should apply to the sensibilities of the adults of the state. And it's like, okay, so what does that mean? Well, you know what it means. I don't know what it means. Could you define what it means? No. I mean, but that's what the law is for. You should be defining what these things mean so that we know whether we're good or not. And it's like, no. See, the people of the state will decide. You'll have a gladiator fight live performance, and then the audience will give a thumbs up or thumbs down at the end of it, depending on how they feel. Well then, don't take the risk, right? Don't take the risk by allowing this law to come to fruition or to allow these rules to be applied, because these rules are applied from the reading of the text when there are, people who are like under the age of 18 allowed to be present, right? So, in other words, if you don't allow people who are under the age of 18 to buy tickets to the performances, then basically the performances, even if they're for general audiences, or even if they accidentally push that boundary that is unwritten, you don't risk the law being enacted. Now, the law that is enacted by this isn't necessarily jail time. It's more using the leverages of the state to impact the businesses in a negative manner. And that could include, removing liquor licenses or imposing fines upon the business that allows said such lurid things to occur within those spaces. Given the context of a bunch of laws that have been passed in Florida recently, a lot of people have tied it to this sort of move against people who are transgender or present as transgender or transgender people interacting with younger audiences, right? The drag book readings and things like that. And unfortunately, that sort of checks out, and I think that's the reason why Megaplex is using an abundance of caution. Because here's the thing, if the governor is willing to go after Disney, of all places, for its quote-unquote wokeism by trying to use his tools in the government to try to, take apart something that was basically seen as bedrock and foundation, which is their special status of that county, right, where they are allowed to run their own facilities, and they have like a special tax district, and the governor DeSantis is willing to upend that, then what chance does a small little furry convention have? And that's sort of is the big ironic thing about this situation. And why, even when covering news, like some of the weirdest thing about covering nonfiction over a period of time is that certain things surprise you a lot less as you move forward in life, right? It's like, oh, well, that happened. Like, it's like, oh, this big thing happened. It's like, well, that happens every day. Or, oh, this thing happens over here. It's like, oh, that happens every day. Like, so you kind of get numb a little bit to it. But never, like, sometimes situations come around that is like, if I went back 20 years ago and said to people in the Florida area, it's like, who are like doing this Megaplex and looking over their shoulder at Disney going, well, we're going to call it Megaplex because we're Disney is a bit conservative, and we're dealing with, we want to do more liberal expression with furry characters than Disney would allow, and we worry about the consequences of Disney if they find out that we're over here in the furry thing doing this more maybe more mature version of Anthroanimals. If I went back and told them, it's like, hey, do you know that in like 20 years, like Disney, like the government is going to go after Disney for being too loose and not conservative enough, and you're also going to be impacted, and basically you and Disney are going to have something in common, like, and are both dealing with some weird out of control governor. Too late to be known as Ron the First, but sure to be known as Ron the Worst. Like, you're both going to be dealing with this person, and they'll be like, "Are you crazy? You're like." like that just seems weird. It seems like a weird thing that, like, both Disney and Megaplex now sort of have a common issue with this governor in power and, like, having to deal with things. But some could say, well, but obviously this brings up another point that kind of came up with this, and that is that some furries felt that Megaplex sort of capitulated here. And the reality is they're not Disney, right? Disney's fighting against Ron DeSantis because they have the power and money to do so. They have the capacity to, sort of fight back against the government using their worldwide corporate, like, influence, right? Whereas, Megaplex ain't going to be able to do that. Like, for obvious reasons, even if it is a top 8 furry convention. Which, by the way, conventions are growing still really rapidly. Furry Week in Atlanta came in with over 10,000 furries, 10,300, which is towards the more things that were in my short video there, towards the higher end. Though, I will say, for Megaplex, there's a little bit of asterisk. They're obviously going to lose attendance over this. So that might be a little bit more of a slow in that growth pattern. And unfortunately, if things continue moving the way they do in Florida, very much you could see Megaplex trying to find a way out of the state if things don't improve. So, like, that could be a possibility in the future. So just keep an eye on it. Hopefully the local furries out there are, going to be okay. Work hard, work together, and try not to be too rough on these things. Everyone's trying to do what they can to survive and have a good time, and unfortunately they had to make a difficult choice, and that difficult choice was furries who are younger would be with their families, and and have a more family friendly experience. Those folks had to be unfortunately sacrificed in this case, just due to that, due to the issue with the performance thing. And the reality is that they didn't have much room to counter, right? And that was a big thing. Is like, why aren't they like Disney fighting it out with the Florida government? And that is another big reason for that. As Boozy Badger would lay out in a tweet thread that he made, is that the issue is that Megaplex is a nonprofit organization in the state of Florida. And because of that, they really don't have that much ability to speak on anything too political. And that is because as a nonprofit organization in the state can very much go, oh, you're talking bad about our governor. You're talking bad about your representative. You're doing that while using this sort of tax benefited status towards raising money and things like that. And by the way, Megaplex had to deal with that too, and that was a whole other tangential news story about an issue where the animal charity that they had gone with for the year, they did a little digging and did a little investigating after, a social media post went sort of viral for all the wrong reasons about whether or not that organization was doing things for the best of the animals, or if it was just being sort of one of those privatized petting zoos that, sort of contributed to the problem it was, trying to say that it was sort of trying to solve at the same time, right? Where it was bringing in exotic animals, not because the person who, was running the facilities liked exotic animals more than for educational purposes, right? They weren't like saving animals from the market trades. They were kind of sort of involved in those market trades of exotic animals as well. And so after doing their, more research and digging, it sounds like they had kind of moved away from that as their trade, their charity this year. And so on top of this 18 plus thing, which is the bigger, obviously the biggest and bigger news story for most furries, there is this side story about like them having to deal with having to change, nonprofit organizations as well. And that on top of this whole thing, is difficult to do too as a nonprofit, because they sort of say this is the sort of thing we do as nonprofit. And a lot of people are like, well, why don't we do a non-animal charity like, GLBT community or something like that? But the issue is that when they put in their nonprofit status, they said they are an animal charity thing, and that was way back when. And changing that status is also going to cause a bunch of legal loopholes and jumping through things. And if they change that status now, like, it may be interpreted as a counter or a political action against the state who is moving in an anti-LGBTQ direction. So once again, it gets really tricky. It's one of those things where on paper, and in a perfect world, absolutely. But in the reality that we live in, it can be difficult, and you have to sometimes weigh the benefits with the risks. And in this case, I think that they're taking that, having some sort of get together and convention for furries in Florida at this time is more beneficial than just completely shutting the doors or trying to rock the boat so much that the state or the unscrupulous actors who will act in behest of the state, vigilantes as it were, will act against the institution. Or even bureaucrats within the government will act against the institution in other ways. And this is an example that Boozy Badger had come across here. That while having a nonprofit comes with some benefits, there's some issues that you have to take into consideration. And that the two basically things that a nonprofit is not allowed to do is to participate in political campaign activity or doing any substantial lobbying about legislation or of any kind. And he goes on to explain that the first stipulation of this rule is relatively easy to understand. He's like, don't start running candidates endorsements or anything like that, saying this candidate good, this candidate bad, allowing a platform for those candidates, etc. The second stipulation, the second part about lobbying, is a little more, once again, a little looser, sort of like that whole, what adults see as proper performance or whatever. It's a little more vague, and if a government really wants to come down, they can kind of try to interpret it as what they want to interpret it as. So basically, you have the situation on the second part where, where it comes to advocacy about laws and lobbying, is like, well, what passes those tests and things like that. So usually you would confer with a lawyer about if you want to make a statement or if you want to make a note about something, what actions you can or cannot take. Obviously, the action to sort of protect their institution and the venues from this law is not, it's taking action based on legislation. They're not really commenting on the legislation. They're taking action based upon this new legislation to protect their venue and their interests, which is definitely not, even though that is an action that happened because of politics, they're not really commenting on the politics itself. They're taking action because of that politic. Though those actions do speak in a way, right? Where it's like they don't trust the Florida government to use discretion and to have forgiveness of any little thing. So they want to basically eliminate that possibility of risk by not allowing people who are ages of 13 to 18 to be allowed to go to the convention or view any performances there, because they don't trust the government to not come down upon the venue with the full force of this new law. And that's what that an action like that states. But that's not lobbying, and that's not lobbying or legislating. That is taking action based upon a law. Now, if they went forward and said, this new law sucks, and you should write your congressman and do that, that sort of moves into the whole lobbying thing. So while furry fans can say, well, this sucks and you should write your legislature and this is why you can't say no politics in the fandom, The institution itself has to basically have its tongue stilled a little bit so that it doesn't do any more undue risk to its institution, unfortunately. And as, Boozy Badger leaves off here saying, in most situations, a lawyer might say, yeah, your First Amendment right, you can say that. But if you really don't want to deal with the wrath of the government, maybe it's best not to say that at all, right? Maybe it's safer to just not do that, right? Even if it is the morally right thing to do. And that's sort of the trickier part about being an adult. It's sort of the trickier part about being a thing. And yes, it's political. And yes, sometimes certain groups can take action and certain groups can't, because certain groups are in a position where they're not at liberty to do certain things because of the position that they're in. Not really thinking about the consequence. When you first, obviously when you make yourself a nonprofit organization, you don't go in the future and think, well, maybe the government will come after, the people of my community in the future, and then me having that stipulation where I can't lobby is going to be a real pain in the neck. But unfortunately, that's the world that Florida is sort of moving towards. At the end of the day, too, as I said, there's some caveats, even though this is bad news in general. I know there's some furries that yeah, 18 plus, yeah, I don't like those kids anyway. Get those little sniveling juveniles out of here. Like, the reality is that, there's, it's a hotel. There's a hotel, there's a facility. Like, even if they're not allowed in the panels and in the dealer's den, there's still gonna be juveniles and kids around in life, and dealing with general audiences is something that we as a society need to accommodate, even if we are in quote unquote 18 plus things all the time. But the reality is also I gotta say this though, on the opposite side of the spectrum, can we stop treating 30-year-old and 24-year-olds and 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds and 60-year-old people as if they're children? And this kind of comes to the state because the concept of this whole, well, we shouldn't allow those people to get together at all because they might pervert the minds of people who are children. I think sometimes I actually am pretty dang certain most of the time they're using the term children as in we're all God's children, and that we're not adults who don't have the liberty to make our own decisions. Because and the reason I can say this with absolute authority, that this is what the case is in this case, is because of other Florida laws that have passed in conjunction with this one that has caused Megaplex to go 18 plus, particularly around hormonal treatments for people who are transgender or transsexual in the state of Florida. The hormonal treatments and things like that, the medical treatments that they're basically disallowed. And it's not, now here's the thing, well, they disallow them for people who are young. Yeah, but that never really occurred in the first place because, the Pediatric Association says that you have to be over the age of 18 before you can be allowed to do that, and you have to go through a ton of therapy and stuff like that. From my understanding, I've never done this kind of thing myself, so I'm going on the basis of understanding that, that sort of surgery has never really occurred from a youthful standpoint. But the reality is that those laws that were supposed to, quote unquote, protect the children also have kind of restricted adults from being able to receive these treatments. So basically, protect the children meant protect all of God's children or the state's children. And the state is taking the role of a father when it should be an uncle. Uncle Sam, you're not my dad, Uncle Sam, you are my uncle. You shouldn't be getting involved in the decisions of the individual, and that's because that's basically the antithesis of what America was about, at least from what I was taught when I was a kid. But maybe my mind was perverted. by the idea of liberty. Oh no. But to me, that's sort of where I'm going to kind of leave this off on, is that, people can say, well, if you read the letter of the law, here's the thing. This law is young, okay? These laws in Florida are pretty young. You can't judge a law by how they're written. You judge a law by how they're enforced. You judge a law by how the actions of the state are done based on those laws. And Megaplex is taking a defensive action here, and a lot of furries, especially people in the transgender community, are being very wary about this law and its implications. Many of them, many folks I've heard want to, desire to move out of the state. And I'll leave this on a positive note, because obviously this is, people are going, well, this is going towards authoritarianism and fascism. I will say this. The good news in my thought on it is, and I hope I'm right about this, but the reality is that what happened in Germany in the 1940s, I don't think is going to happen in the United States in the 2020s or 2030s. I think it might happen in a state or two. It could very easily. But the reason that the United States is a bit different than Germany is that the United States is a group of states that are under one federalist system. And the states themselves are the size of a country. Germany in the 1940s is Germany in the 1940s, right? The things that happened within the borders ended up bleeding off into the other, countries around it, because they became very authoritative and they started becoming violent with the states around them, or the things around them, right? But at the end of the day, the issues were contained in Germany before they started spreading out. Same thing could happen here. So, but the issue is that when we're talking about something like this, or a conflict like this, a situation where the country is so large that it would become a more civil issue than it would become a global worldwide issue. Obviously, with states trying to look for power and moves forward wherever they can, it's very much not in the best interest of the United States to fight itself. But historically, when it comes down to an absolute liberty and whether or not this thing is going to be a draw on the line in the sand, that's probably the worst thing that can happen, right? Is that it's not going to be an issue where you'd have to change countries or try to flee an entire country. You would have to flee a state. And that's sort of happened in that past too, before that first civil conflict in the 1800s. People fled states in which their rights were basically treated as non-existent, to states where they were treated more humanly, until those states where they were treating those people as less than human, black slaves as less than human, started to try to attack or get angry at the states where those people that they treated as non-people were treated as free, right? So I think similar, if the trajectory of these kind of civil rights move in that direction, it'll happen similarly this time. Obviously, I would like there to be not a non-violent solution to this thing, that things continue to progress over time where adults can be free to be who they are, without having to deal with bloodshed and conflict. But unfortunately, as time goes on, it seems like that's the direction that some people on social media want to go. And if that's the direction they want to go, unfortunately, when it comes to history, people can only have so much impact on the direction that it goes. Because to me, there's actually 3 understandings of history. Those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. Those who know So that when you say those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it, we talk about that as if you don't remember your history, you're condemned to repeat it. So if you know your history, then you will try to avoid repeating mistakes of the past. That's the second phase. But the third phase is this. You realize that society, as a whole is based upon people who have varying understandings and degrees of knowledge about history. But there are some people who think that they're always on the right side of history, even if they are on the wrong side of history. And the people who believe that their incorrectness is ordained by a higher power, that their crushing of another person's liberty is ordained by God, and they move forward in that direction, believing that they're in the right to suppress or harm other people because their God says it's okay, then those people exist in that history. They existed back then. Therefore, there's nothing you can do to repeat that problem from reoccurring. And thus, all you can do is prepare what you do in those times. Anyways, thank you very much for watching. Feel free to help the algorithms out any way you want. Kick the like, kick the subscribe button, kick a comment in the comment section. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good night. Thanks, guys. And to the people working hard at Megaplex, thank you for your hard work and dedication. A lot of people and a lot of things just like aren't going well, and you deserve all the praise you get if you get through and hopefully you guys get through your convention with no hitches. And I really hope that everything goes well at that convention, and that you guys continue to grow in spite of the headwinds that you face, the hurricane-like headwinds, honestly, that you face. Maybe you and Disney can work together to deal with your problems. I don't know. Anyways, thanks. Have a good one.